My dad called me at 1:30 in the morning, his voice trembling so hard I could barely understand him. He was at the police station. My sister-in-law had just beaten him with a baseball bat, but she told the cops he attacked her in a psychotic rage. My own brother just stood there and let it happen. When I walked into that precinct, the desk officer tried to kick me out. He had no idea who I was, but the moment I dropped my badge on his desk, all the color drained from his face. He stammered, completely terrified. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to step up and destroy the people who tried to ruin your family. My name is Gwendolyn. I am 33 years old, and I work as a senior forensic accountant for a federal financial task force in Chicago. I track hidden money, expose corporate fraud, and put white-collar criminals in federal prison. I spend my days dealing with some of the most manipulative liars in the country, but I never expected to find the absolute worst of them sitting in my own family tree. The phone call that shattered my life came dead in the middle of a freezing Tuesday night. I was jolted awake by the sharp ringing of my cell phone. When I answered, the voice on the other end barely sounded like my father. Thomas is a proud, quiet man of 68, the kind of father who worked decades in a steel mill to provide for us and never asked for a single favor in return. But right then, he sounded small, terrified, and in intense physical pain. He whispered that he was at the local police precinct. He told me that Jasmine, my brother's wife, had struck him in the head with a solid aluminum baseball bat. The nightmare did not end there. He choked back a sob as he explained that Jasmine and my brother Cameron had called the police themselves, claiming my father had suffered a violent dementia episode and tried to murder them. I did not even bother changing out of my sweatpants. I threw a heavy winter trench coat over my sleepwear, grabbed my federal credentials, and sprinted to my car. The drive to the precinct took less than 15 minutes, but my mind was racing the entire way, assembling the pieces of their toxic dynamic. Cameron had always been a coward, constantly masking his massive financial failures and gambling debts with leased luxury cars and fake confidence. 2 years ago, he married Jasmine, a stunning, sharp-tongued African-American woman whose appetite for designer brands vastly exceeded Cameron's actual income. They had moved into my father's spacious house, under the guise of helping to take care of him after my mother passed away. I knew they were just using him for free rent, so Jasmine could afford her expensive shopping habits, but I never imagined their greed would escalate to physical violence. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the police precinct, the harsh fluorescent lights instantly giving me a headache. The lobby smelled of stale coffee and cheap floor wax, but my eyes immediately locked onto the scene unfolding near the front desk. Jasmine was putting on an absolute masterclass in theatrical manipulation. She was wearing a torn silk blouse, her mascara perfectly smudged down her cheeks, weeping uncontrollably into her hands. Cameron had his arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, playing the role of the traumatized, protective husband. And then I saw him. My father was slouched on a cold metal bench in the far corner of the room. A thick, bloody bandage was pressed clumsily against his forehead, and his right wrist was secured to the bench with a heavy steel handcuff. The sight of my gentle, aging father treated like a violent criminal made the blood roar in my ears. I marched straight across the lobby, my boots clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. As I approached, Jasmine's loud, dramatic wailing echoed off the concrete walls. She was screaming to the booking officer that she had genuinely feared for her life. She claimed my father had completely lost his mind, that his eyes had gone dead, and that he had grabbed an 8-inch kitchen knife and lunged at her throat. She sobbed that she only grabbed the baseball bat from the hallway closet because she had no other choice to defend herself against a crazed maniac. Cameron nodded vigorously, his face twisted into an expression of fake agony. He leaned over the counter and told the officer that it broke his heart to say it, but his father's mental decline had become a severe danger to society. He insisted that Thomas belonged in a locked psychiatric ward immediately before he ended up killing someone in his sleep. I stepped right between them and the front desk. I did not raise my voice, but the absolute ice in my tone made Cameron flinch backward. I demanded that the officer remove the handcuffs from my father this instant. Jasmine stopped fake crying for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing as she glared at me. She quickly recovered her act, pointing a shaking finger at me and crying out to the police that I was the estranged absentee daughter who knew nothing about the daily nightmare of living with a violent, deranged old man. The young desk cop, Officer Davies, stepped out from behind the counter. He puffed out his chest, placing a hand on his utility belt, and told me I needed to step back behind the yellow line, or he would have me removed from the building for interfering with an active domestic assault investigation. He looked me up and down, clearly seeing nothing but a frantic woman in sweatpants and a trench coat. He firmly stated that my father was under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and that I had absolutely no authority to dictate police procedure in his precinct. I did not argue. I did not scream. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my coat, pulled out my leather credentials case, and slammed it down onto the metal counter with a sharp, resounding crack. The heavy gold shield of the Federal Financial Task Force gleamed under the precinct lights. I looked Officer Davies dead in the eye and introduced myself by my full government title. I calmly informed him that I was the exact same senior forensic accountant who less than 30 days ago had completely audited, dismantled, and secured federal indictments against the police captain and 4 senior detectives in the neighboring county for widespread corruption and racketeering. Officer Davies leaned forward, his eyes darting from the gold badge to my face. The arrogant posture completely vanished. All the color drained from his cheeks in an instant. He suddenly realized that the woman he was trying to kick out of his lobby had the direct authority and the ruthless reputation to end his entire career with a single phone call to the Department of Justice. He took a nervous step back, his mouth opening and closing like a fish caught out of water. He stammered, choking on his own words, unable to form a complete sentence. He managed a weak, trembling apology, his hands visibly shaking as he looked from me to the federal badge and then over to my handcuffed father. Cameron and Jasmine stood frozen. The smug satisfaction on my brother's face instantly evaporated, replaced by a creeping, suffocating terror. They had thought they were setting up a helpless old man to take the fall in a sleepy local precinct. They had no idea they had just declared war on the federal government. The dead silence in the precinct lobby lasted for exactly 5 seconds. Officer Davies had practically flattened himself against the back wall, terrified of accidentally stepping on the toes of a federal agent. But Jasmine was not the kind of woman to surrender, just because the odds shifted against her. She had spent her entire adult life bullying her way into luxury, and she was not about to let my badge stand between her and my father's assets. She quickly recovered from her initial shock, her posture straightening as she wiped away the last of her fake tears. She scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes, and telling Officer Davies to do his job, because federal financial accountants have absolutely no jurisdiction over local domestic disputes. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me and confidently declared that my fancy title did not change the fact that they were dealing with a violent, unstable senior citizen. Jasmine reached into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder. She slapped it down onto the metal counter with a sharp smack that made my father flinch on his bench. She proudly announced that my badge was entirely irrelevant because she and Cameron held total legal authority over Thomas. She opened the folder and tapped a manicured nail against a crisp, official-looking document. She declared it was a signed and notarized 550 involuntary psychiatric hold, complete with an expedited medical recommendation for a permanent conservatorship. She turned to face the room, raising her voice, so every tired police officer in the lobby could hear her tragic narrative. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of my father as a deeply delusional man whose brain was turning to mush. She claimed he had been wandering the halls at night talking to people who were not there and leaving the gas stove burning for hours. Then she dropped the detail she clearly thought was her ultimate winning card. She announced that Thomas had become so dangerously senile that he completely forgot to pay the mortgage on the family home last month. She dramatically placed a hand over her heart and cried out that my father was going to get them all evicted and throw them out onto the street. She claimed that she and Cameron were the real victims, a young couple sacrificing their own happiness to carry the crushing financial and emotional burden of a man who could no longer function in society. She insisted this conservatorship was not a choice, but a desperate rescue mission to take over his estate for his own good. Cameron immediately stepped right into his supporting role. He walked over to me, letting his shoulders slump to look like a man utterly defeated by the tragic reality of an aging parent. He looked at me with fake tear-filled eyes and tried to weaponize my own career against me. He said this was the hardest day of his entire life, but someone had to be the responsible adult. He told me that I would know exactly how bad things had gotten at the house if I actually bothered to visit instead of obsessing over building my powerful federal career in the city. He laid a heavy hand on my shoulder and tried to sound like a gentle, heartbroken son. He begged me not to interfere with legal protocol. He pleaded with me to step aside and let medical science do its job, claiming that once they were granted full control of his estate, they could finally use his assets to pay for the specialized locked-down psychiatric care he desperately needed. I did not blink. I did not move away from his touch. I simply reached out and pulled the manila folder across the counter toward me. Jasmine smirked, crossing her arms over her chest, looking like a woman who had just won the lottery. She was looking at me with pure triumph, undoubtedly already calculating the total value of my father's estate in her head, ready to liquidate his life savings the second he was locked behind the doors of a mental ward. I opened the folder. I slowly read the physician's sworn statement, my eyes scanning the heavily worded paragraphs, detailing severe cognitive decline and violent tendencies. I looked at the bold, sweeping signature at the very bottom of the page. It belonged to a Dr. Richard Henderson. A laugh escaped my throat before I could stop it. It was not a happy sound. It was a cold, sharp, freezing laugh that echoed off the concrete walls of the precinct. Officer Davies jumped. My father looked up from the bench, his eyes wide with confusion. I closed the folder, gripped the top edge of the thick legal paper, and tore it straight down the middle. The loud, ripping sound made Jasmine gasp. I put the two halves together, ripped them again, and then let the shredded pieces flutter down onto the dirty linoleum floor, right to land across Jasmine's expensive boots. Jasmine completely lost her composure. She screamed that I had just destroyed a legally binding medical directive. She demanded that Officer Davies arrest me immediately for tampering with official evidence and obstructing a medical mandate. I stepped directly into Jasmine's personal space, forcing her to back up against the front desk. I told her that she had just handed a federal financial investigator a forged document signed by a ghost. I kept my voice terrifyingly calm as I explained that Dr. Richard Henderson was not a respected local physician making a difficult call about an elderly man's mental health. I informed her that Dr. Henderson was the central target of a massive multi-million-dollar Medicare billing fraud investigation that my exact task force had been building for the last 8 months. I explained that his clinic was notorious for selling fake medical diagnoses to predatory family members looking to force their wealthy relatives into conservatorships. I looked at Cameron, whose jaw had practically hit the floor, and delivered the exact reality of his situation. I told them that exactly 12 hours ago, I had personally signed the financial injunction that allowed federal marshals to raid Henderson's private clinic, seize every single one of his hard drives, and permanently suspend his medical license. I let that fact hang in the heavy air of the precinct for a long moment before delivering the final blow. I told my brother and his wife that any document bearing Henderson's signature dated today was not a valid medical directive. It was a piece of federal evidence proving they had actively conspired with a known criminal to commit elder abuse and fraud. The heavy steel handcuffs unlocked with a sharp metallic click that echoed through the quiet precinct lobby. Officer Davies did not say a single word. He simply took 2 large steps backward, keeping his hands entirely visible, clearly wanting absolutely nothing to do with the federal storm I had just brought into his station. My father let out a long, ragged exhale as he rubbed his bruised wrist, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. I immediately knelt beside the cold metal bench, pulling a fresh linen handkerchief from my coat pocket to press firmly against the bleeding gash on his forehead. His hands were shaking violently, but as I looked into his eyes, I did not see the foggy, confused stare of dementia that my brother had tried to sell to the police. I saw crystal clear, burning betrayal. My father pushed himself up to a seated position, his posture straightening despite his injuries and his age. He looked right past me, fixing his gaze directly on Cameron. His voice was raspy and tired, but it carried an absolute certainty that commanded the attention of every single police officer in the room. He looked at the desk sergeant and stated clearly that he did not forget to pay the mortgage, and he certainly did not suffer any kind of psychotic break. He explained that earlier tonight he had gone to the kitchen for a glass of water and noticed a torn, heavy envelope shoved hastily into the very bottom of the recycling bin. It had his primary bank logo printed on the front. My father had pulled it out and smoothed it flat on the granite counter. It was the quarterly statement for his 401k retirement account. The entire precinct went dead silent as my father revealed the devastating truth of what really happened in that house. He stated that he had worked brutal double shifts at the steel mill for 40 straight years to build that specific account, sacrificing his own comfort and health so Cameron could grow up with whatever he wanted. The balance was supposed to be exactly $400,000, a carefully protected safety net meant to cover his twilight years. But the statement he pulled from the trash showed a balance of exactly zero. Every single penny had been systematically drained, wired out in massive, unauthorized chunks to unknown holding accounts over the past 3 weeks. My father raised his hand and pointed a trembling, calloused finger directly at Jasmine. He told the police that when he confronted the two of them in the kitchen with the bank statement clutched in his hand, Cameron had panicked like a coward. My brother had actually tried to physically wrestle the paper away from an old man. But Jasmine did not panic, and she did not argue. My father described how Jasmine simply turned her back, walked calmly into the main hallway, and opened the utility closet. She reached past the winter coats and pulled out the solid aluminum baseball bat that Cameron kept for home defense. She did not scream or yell. She just walked up behind my father while he was turning away to dial the police and swung the metal bat directly at the back of his skull. My father explained that he only managed to turn his head at the very last second, taking the brutal glancing blow to his forehead instead of the back of his neck, an impact that still knocked him completely unconscious onto the kitchen tile. Cameron immediately erupted into a chaotic, desperate performance to save his own skin. He threw his hands up in the air, sweating profusely through his expensive dress shirt, frantically looking at Officer Davies and the other cops. He started shouting that this wild, unbelievable story was the exact proof the police needed to lock his father away. He yelled that Thomas was completely delusional, mixing up his own reality with some crime thriller he probably watched on television earlier that evening. Cameron insisted that he only managed the household finances because his father's brain was literally rotting away from disease. He loudly claimed that the retirement account was perfectly fine, fully funded, and that Thomas was just hallucinating missing money to justify why he grabbed a heavy kitchen knife and tried to murder his own daughter-in-law in cold blood. Cameron begged the police to see reason, screaming that a man who invents imaginary bank statements out of thin air is a severe, unpredictable danger to himself and society. But Jasmine was much smarter and far more ruthless than my brother. She recognized immediately that the financial fraud angle I had just introduced was a massive looming threat, but she also knew how the system worked. She knew that a federal financial investigation would take months to subpoena bank records and trace wire transfers. She needed to win the physical assault narrative right now to get my father locked away before sunrise. She smoothed down the fabric of her torn designer blouse, her posture instantly shifting from a weeping, traumatized victim to a hardened, calculating predator. She stepped away from Cameron's side and walked uncomfortably close to where I was standing next to my father. Jasmine crossed her arms tightly over her chest, a wicked, triumphant smirk spreading across her lips. She looked me up and down with utter contempt, completely unfazed by my credentials. She told me that I could flash my shiny federal badge all I wanted, but it meant absolutely nothing in a local precinct regarding a violent domestic assault. She boldly stated that tomorrow morning they would simply hire a brand new doctor, pay cash, to get a new psychiatric hold, signed and lock my father away in a state facility before my precious federal task force could even file a single piece of paperwork. She leaned in her voice, dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper, meant to intimidate me, but she spoke loud enough for the officers to hear her ultimate trump card. She reminded me that my father was notoriously old-fashioned and incredibly paranoid about his privacy. She pointed out that he had strictly forbidden anyone from installing a single security camera anywhere inside or outside that house. There was no doorbell camera, no hallway monitor, absolutely nothing to capture what happened in that kitchen. Jasmine smiled a chilling expression of pure arrogance and threw down her ultimate challenge. She told me to go ahead and try to prove her wrong. She laughed right in my face and declared that without a single frame of video evidence, it was just the highly credible word of a successful young couple against the insane ramblings of a crazy, bleeding old man. Jasmine stood her ground in the middle of the precinct lobby, reveling in her perceived victory. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, the torn fabric of her expensive designer blouse shifting as she lifted her chin in absolute defiance. She looked around the room, making sure every single police officer saw her unshakable confidence. She practically gloated as she reminded Officer Davies that the burden of proof rested entirely on my shoulders. Without a weapon bearing her fingerprints or a video recording of the so-called attack, she declared it was nothing more than a messy domestic dispute involving a highly confused senior citizen. Cameron stepped up right beside his wife, suddenly emboldened by her ruthless logic. He adjusted his collar, trying to regain the posture of a concerned, responsible son. He told the police that they should stop wasting time and process the paperwork for my father's psychiatric hold immediately. He argued that letting a violent man walk out of the station was a massive legal liability for the police department, and he threatened to hold them personally accountable if Thomas hurt anyone else. Officer Davies shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between my federal badge resting on the counter and the very real legal hurdle Jasmine had just thrown down. He knew she was technically right. A bleeding head and a wild accusation from an elderly man were simply not enough to lock up a well-dressed suburban couple without hard, undeniable evidence. I did not yell. I did not argue with her legal assessment. I simply looked at Jasmine and let a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. That smile made the smug satisfaction instantly vanish from my brother's eyes. I took a deliberate step forward, the sound of my boots echoing against the concrete floor, and I completely agreed with her. I looked at the desk sergeant and calmly stated that my sister-in-law was absolutely correct about my father. I told the room that Thomas despised modern technology with a passion. I explained that the man still used a rotary phone in the kitchen, utterly refused to own a smartphone, and viewed digital security systems as a massive invasion of his personal privacy. Jasmine let out a loud, triumphant scoff, turning to Officer Davies with her hands raised, as if my agreement was the ultimate victory. She demanded to know why they were still standing around when the federal agent herself had just admitted there was zero proof to back up the crazy old man's story. She told the cops to wrap it up so she could go home and recover from her terrible trauma. She stopped talking the exact second I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy matte black digital tablet. The device was encased in thick military-grade rubber, glowing softly with a heavily encrypted biometric lock screen. I pressed my thumb against the sensor, the screen flashing green as it verified my federal clearance. I kept my eyes locked on Cameron as I spoke. I asked my brother if he remembered a very specific Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 years ago. I reminded him of the day he sneaked into our father's home office, dug through the locked filing cabinet, and attempted to forge a quitclaim deed to transfer the family property into his own name, just to cover a string of catastrophic underground investments. Cameron's face drained of all color. He stammered frantically, looking around the police station, loudly denying that he ever did such a thing, and demanding to know what ancient history had to do with tonight's assault. I ignored his rising panic and told the room that I had caught him red-handed in the act. But instead of sending my own brother to state prison back then, I decided to permanently neutralize the threat he posed to our father. I explained that I immediately wired the remaining balance of the mortgage directly to the bank, paying off the house entirely in one single untraceable transaction. Jasmine scoffed again, though her voice shook slightly this time. She asked what paying off the mortgage had to do with anything, loudly reminding everyone that the house was still entirely in Thomas's name, which gave them the right to manage his estate since he was living under their care. I tapped the screen of my tablet, bringing up an official county property deed, and turned the glowing screen around for her and the police officers to see. I told her that she was completely wrong. I explained that the day I paid off the debt, I legally transferred the entire estate out of my father's name and placed it into a highly secure blind trust. I looked right into Jasmine's widening eyes and delivered the reality check she never saw coming. I stated that Thomas was not the owner of that property. I am the sole trustee. I am the legal homeowner. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Cameron stumbled backward, bumping hard into a wanted poster on the precinct wall, his breathing turning shallow and rapid. Jasmine opened her mouth to argue, but absolutely no sound came out. The arrogant armor she had been wearing all night shattered into a million pieces. I turned my attention back to the encrypted tablet in my hands, swiping past the property deed to a secure federal surveillance application. I told them that as the legal owner of the property, I had every right to secure my investment against potential domestic threats. I revealed that exactly 6 months ago I had dispatched an independent security contractor to install hidden 4K federal-grade security cameras directly inside the living room, the kitchen, and the main hallway. I tapped the playback icon on the screen, set the volume to maximum, and announced to the silent police station that we no longer needed to rely on anyone's word because we had the entire brutal assault recorded in ultra-high definition. I walked over to the desk sergeant's station and grabbed the wireless casting cable hanging from the side of their main evidence monitor. I plugged it directly into my tablet without asking for permission. The massive television screen on the precinct wall flickered for a brief second before snapping to a crystal-clear full-color feed of my father's kitchen. The quality of the federal-grade lenses was undeniable. You could see the exact texture of the granite countertops and the slight trembling of my father's hands as he stood by the recycling bin. I pressed play. The audio kicked in loud and sharp, echoing through the dead silence of the police station. Every single officer in the lobby stopped what they were doing. They turned their full attention to the screen, watching the very incident that Jasmine had just spent the last hour lying about with fake tears streaming down her face. On the screen, the timestamp read exactly 11:45 at night. My father was holding the torn bank envelope. He looked exhausted, his shoulders heavy with the weight of a man who had just discovered his entire life savings had vanished into thin air. A few seconds later, Cameron and Jasmine walked into the frame. Jasmine was wearing the exact same designer blouse she currently had on, except in the video the fabric was perfectly intact. There were no tears, no rips, no signs of a struggle. Cameron looked irritated, holding a glass of water, completely unaware that his entire life was about to implode. On the video, my father held up the financial statement. His voice was thick with heartbreak as he asked his only son why the retirement account was empty. He asked Cameron how he could steal 40 years of hard work from his own flesh and blood. We watched the digital version of my brother freeze in panic. He stuttered, avoiding my father's eyes, and mumbled a pathetic excuse about a temporary cash flow problem and a bad investment. There was no screaming from my father. There was no wild dementia-fueled rage. My father simply shook his head, turned his back on them, and said he was going to the living room to call the authorities. He did not grab a kitchen knife. He did not even raise his voice. He just looked like a man whose heart had been shattered by the boy he raised. As my father turned away, the hidden camera captured Jasmine's reaction perfectly. There was no fear in her eyes. There was only cold, calculating rage. The police officers in the lobby watched in absolute horror as Jasmine calmly stepped out of the kitchen frame for exactly 4 seconds. When she stepped back into view, she was gripping a solid aluminum baseball bat. She did not hesitate. She did not shout a warning. She simply walked up behind an old man whose back was turned and swung the heavy metal bat with terrifying force. The sickening crack of aluminum hitting bone echoed from the precinct speakers. We watched my father collapse onto the kitchen tile, motionless. We watched Cameron flinch and jump backward, putting his hands over his mouth in shock. But the most damning part of the video was what Jasmine did next. She did not drop the bat in horror. She stood over my father's unconscious body, looked down at him with pure disgust, and then reached up and deliberately ripped the collar of her own expensive silk blouse. She was actively staging the crime scene. She was preparing the exact lie she would tell the police less than an hour later. I tapped the screen and paused the video on the exact frame where Jasmine was tearing her own clothes. I unplugged the cable and turned to face the lobby. The silence in the police station was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that happens right before a massive storm breaks. The officers who had been listening to Jasmine's sobbing victim routine just moments ago were now staring at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. They realized they had been manipulated by a vicious predator who was willing to hospitalize an elderly man and use law enforcement to finish the job. Jasmine's face was completely drained of blood. Her flawless makeup now looked like a clown mask over pale, terrified skin. She took a stumbling step backward, her mouth opening and closing as she desperately searched for a new lie, a new angle, any possible excuse to explain away the high-definition violence we had all just witnessed. But there was nothing left to say. The video was an airtight, undeniable execution of her entire false narrative. The smug, arrogant woman who had challenged me to prove her wrong just minutes earlier was now physically shrinking under the intense, furious glare of half a dozen police officers. Officer Davies did not ask another question. He did not ask for a statement or a clarification. His face flushed bright red with anger at having been lied to so brazenly in his own station. He unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt, the metallic sound ringing out like a death knell for the golden couple. He stepped squarely toward Jasmine, pulling his shoulders back, ordering her to place her hands behind her back immediately. Seeing the handcuffs, the absolute reality of prison crashed down on my brother. The illusion of their unified, wealthy marriage evaporated in a split second. Cameron, terrified of spending the next decade in a state penitentiary for elder abuse and assault, instantly threw his hands in the air. He stumbled away from his wife as if she were contagious, pointed a shaking finger directly at her face, and screamed at the top of his lungs that he had absolutely nothing to do with the physical attack. He shrieked that the entire scheme was her idea, that she had planned the fake medical hold, and that she had forced him into doing it. The echoing shouts of my brother exposing his wife's luxury purchases hung heavily in the stale air of the police precinct. Jasmine stood pinned between two patrol officers, her chest heaving as she processed the absolute ruin of her situation. She looked at the blinking red lights of the police body cameras recording every single second of their mutual destruction. The local cops had her on tape swinging a baseball bat at an elderly man, and her own husband had just loudly implicated her in the grand theft of a $400,000 retirement fund. She was staring down the barrel of a massive state prison sentence, and her panicked eyes darted wildly around the lobby as she calculated her remaining options. Jasmine was a predator, and predators do not simply surrender when cornered. They look for a larger piece of meat to throw to the wolves. I watched her posture shift in real time. The manic, screaming fury evaporated from her face, replaced by a cold, calculating desperation. She violently shook off the hands of the arresting officers, squared her shoulders, and turned her back on Cameron completely. She locked eyes with the senior desk sergeant and announced that she wanted to make a formal statement on the record. She loudly declared that she was ready to cooperate fully with law enforcement and that she wanted to negotiate a plea deal right there on the spot. Cameron let out a strangled gasp, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he realized his wife was about to dig a hole so deep neither of them would ever climb out. Jasmine ignored his pathetic whimpering and told the police that the $400,000 theft from the retirement account was nothing compared to the massive financial conspiracy her husband had just executed. She claimed that she was living in absolute terror of Cameron and his violent loan shark connections. She spun a brilliant, desperate lie, telling the officers that she only went along with the retirement theft because Cameron threatened to have the syndicate come after her if she opened her mouth. Then she dropped the anchor that dragged the entire situation from a severe domestic crime straight into a major corporate felony. Jasmine confessed that just last Thursday, Cameron had grown incredibly desperate because the underground betting syndicate had doubled the interest on his gambling debt. The retirement money was not enough to save his kneecaps. She told the stunned police officers that Cameron had set his sights on the ultimate prize, He had targeted the family house knowing the property was fully paid off and sitting on over $500,000 in untouched equity. Jasmine detailed exactly how my brother pulled it off. She explained that Cameron had spent weeks securing an insider at the local community bank, a corrupt branch manager who was willing to push fraudulent paperwork through the system for a sizable cut of the profits. She described how Cameron forged my father's signature on a massive second mortgage application, applying for a $500,000 home equity line of credit against the property. She threw my brother completely into the fire, explaining that the bank insider deliberately bypassed the mandatory notary requirements, forged the digital verification stamps, and rubber stamped the massive loan approval without my father ever stepping foot inside a bank branch. Cameron looked like his legs were about to give out beneath him. He grabbed the edge of the metal booking counter just to keep himself standing. He screamed that she was a liar, shouting that Jasmine was the one who actually drafted the fraudulent mortgage documents on her laptop because she wanted the leftover equity to buy a vacation condo. He shrieked that her signature was on the secondary guarantor line, right next to his forged version of our father's name, meaning she was equally guilty of the bank fraud. They were both drowning desperately, shoving each other's heads underwater to catch a single breath of air. Jasmine simply raised her voice over his screaming, telling the desk sergeant that she could provide the exact email chains, the digital transfer receipts, and the text messages between Cameron and the corrupt bank manager. She offered to hand the police an entire network of financial fraud and a corrupt banking official on a silver platter. She demanded full immunity for the retirement fund theft and a vastly reduced sentence for the physical assault in exchange for her full cooperation as a star witness for the prosecution. She stood tall, breathing heavily, genuinely believing she had just outsmarted the entire room by trading up to a bigger crime. I stood quietly near the wooden benches, listening to every single word of her brilliant, desperate confession. I let the silence stretch for a few moments, allowing Jasmine to soak in her false sense of security. Then I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sound of my boots against the concrete floor made Jasmine flinch. I crossed my arms and looked at my sister-in-law with a smile so sharp it could cut glass. I told Jasmine that her legal strategy was genuinely impressive for someone who had zero understanding of financial jurisdiction. I explained that if my father actually owned the house, forging a lien against his property with a local bank would indeed be a state-level crime. A serious felony that the local district attorney might actually cut a plea deal for in exchange for taking down a corrupt bank manager. The color began to drain from Jasmine's face as the tone of my voice shifted from conversational to strictly professional. I reminded her of the heavily encrypted digital tablet I had shown them just a few minutes ago. I reminded her that my father did not own the property they just tried to leverage. I stated clearly that the house was legally owned by a blind trust, and I was the sole federal administrator of that trust. I watched the absolute horror dawn in her eyes as I broke down the devastating reality of the confession she had just voluntarily given to a room full of police body cameras. I explained that when Cameron and his bank insider transmitted those forged mortgage documents across digital banking servers to place a fraudulent lien on an asset owned by a federal employee's trust, they crossed a massive, inescapable jurisdictional boundary. I informed Jasmine that she did not just confess to local property fraud. She had just provided a full, detailed, and uncoerced confession to federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud against a federal entity. Jasmine took a staggering step backward, her knees trembling as the sheer magnitude of her mistake crashed down upon her. She had tried to leverage a local plea deal to escape an assault charge, but in doing so, she had accidentally handed a federal forensic accountant the exact confession needed to trigger an automatic federal investigation. I looked at the two of them shivering in the bright precinct lights and calmly announced that the jurisdiction over their lives had just permanently shifted from the local police department directly to the United States government. Cameron stared at me with eyes wide with absolute unadulterated terror. The moment the word federal left my lips, his entire survival strategy collapsed into dust. He knew exactly what federal prison meant. There was no early parole, no overcrowded county jail systems to slip through, and no lenient local judges he could bribe or charm. The reality of federal mandatory minimums hit him so hard, his knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the edge of the booking desk, knuckles turning white, as he desperately tried to backpedal away from the catastrophic confession his wife had just vomited onto the precinct floor. He turned toward Officer Davies, sweat pouring down his face, and began shouting that Jasmine was a complete pathological liar. Cameron frantically claimed that there was no bank insider and absolutely no secondary mortgage. He shrieked that Jasmine was just a vindictive, hysterical woman who knew she was going to jail for assaulting an elderly man with a baseball bat, so she was making up wild federal offenses just to drag her own husband down with her. He insisted that he was a victim of her manipulative rage. He loudly declared that branch manager Henderson was an upstanding pillar of the local financial community, and that Jasmine was throwing a respectable banker's name into the mud simply because she was desperate and cornered. Cameron pleaded with the room to ignore her swearing on his life that no such fraudulent mortgage application ever existed. I did not raise my voice to argue with him. I did not need to. I simply walked over to the corner of the front desk, unlatched the heavy clasps of my leather briefcase, and pulled out my federal issue laptop. I flipped the screen open. The harsh blue light illuminated my face in the dim precinct lobby as I typed in my decryption keys. I ignored Cameron's frantic screaming and looked directly at the local officers standing around the room. I told them that the defining trait of incompetent criminals is their absolute failure to understand how digital financial security actually works. I kept my gaze locked on my screen as I explained the reality of my daily life. I stated that as a senior investigator managing highly sensitive blind trusts for federal employees, my assets are monitored by an automated military-grade surveillance grid. I informed Cameron that my systems do not wait for a monthly paper statement to arrive in the mail. My security protocols trigger an immediate high-priority alert the exact second any unauthorized entity runs a hard credit inquiry or requests a title verification against any property under my legal administration. I turned the laptop around so Cameron could see the glowing dashboard of my forensic database. I told him that exactly 3 days ago, right in the middle of my lunch break, my secure phone lit up with a critical alert. Someone had attempted to initiate a massive equity draw against the house. The system logged the exact IP address, the precise timestamp, and the unique employee identification number attached to the digital inquiry. I watched Cameron's chest heave as he struggled to breathe, his eyes glued to the data scrolling across my screen. I explained that I did not call the local police when I saw that alert. Instead, I ran a full federal background check on the employee ID that initiated the unauthorized title search. I broke down the entire timeline for him. I revealed that the ID belonged directly to his inside man branch manager Henderson. But I did not stop there. I told Cameron that federal forensic accountants do not just look at a single transaction, we pull the entire thread. Within 2 hours of that alert, my team had completely dissected Henderson's personal finances. We discovered a string of massive unexplained cash deposits and corresponding offshore wire transfers that perfectly matched the exact money laundering profile of the underground sports betting syndicate Cameron owed his life to. I told my brother that his supposedly respectable banker was actually a degenerate gambler who was drowning in syndicate debt right alongside him. Henderson was using his banking credentials to push through fraudulent loans for desperate people in exchange for a hefty cut to pay off his own loan sharks. Cameron stood paralyzed. The desperate shouting had completely died in his throat. He was staring at me like I was a ghost. He slowly realized that I had been tracking his master plan for days before he even forged my father's signature on the final documents. I leaned across the precinct desk, closed my laptop with a sharp snap, and delivered the hook that shattered his last remaining shred of hope. I told Cameron that his brilliant insider did not quietly process that $500,000 line of credit. I informed him that the exact moment Henderson hit the final approval key, my task force froze the funds in the federal clearinghouse. The money never moved. The massive payout Cameron was counting on to save his kneecaps from the syndicate never actually hit his checking account. I watched the absolute despair wash over my brother's face as I delivered the final crushing detail. I told him that he could stop defending Henderson's honor because I had personally dispatched a team of federal agents to that community bank branch earlier this very afternoon. I stated clearly that his inside man was dragged out of his corner office in handcuffs in front of his entire staff before the bank even closed its doors for the weekend. Henderson was currently sitting in a federal holding cell downtown, crying like a baby and turning state's evidence. I smiled coldly and informed Cameron that the banker had already handed over every single text message, encrypted email, and recorded phone call detailing their entire mortgage fraud conspiracy. The escape route was completely obliterated, the money was gone, and the federal trap had officially snapped shut around his neck. Cameron violently shook his head, refusing to accept the reality of the trap that had just snapped shut around him. He slammed his hand onto the booking desk, the loud smack echoing through the stunned silence of the police precinct. He pointed a trembling finger at Jasmine and shouted that I was entirely bluffing. He screamed that his wife was a vindictive, hysterical liar who had just invented a wild story about a fraudulent second mortgage simply to secure a desperate plea deal. He turned to Officer Davies, sweat pouring down his forehead, and loudly declared that I was just a glorified bookkeeper playing a vicious psychological game to scare him into a false confession. He insisted that Henderson was a highly respected vice president of the local community bank, a pillar of the financial sector, who would never risk his lucrative career to push through a fake loan for anyone. Cameron desperately tried to convince the room that I had no actual proof of any bank fraud, clinging to the delusion that his master plan was still perfectly intact. I did not raise my voice to argue with his frantic denial. I simply turned my laptop screen slightly more toward him and hit the refresh key on my federal database interface. I told Cameron that the defining trait of arrogant criminals is their absolute refusal to understand the digital footprint they leave behind. I informed him that I did not need a signed confession from him because the bank's own encrypted servers had already testified against him in real time. I pointed to the glowing rows of data scrolling across my screen and walked him through the exact, undeniable sequence of events. I asked him if he remembered exactly where he was on Tuesday afternoon at precisely 2:14. I did not wait for his answer. I told him that while he was sitting in his leased luxury car in the bank parking lot, sweating through his designer shirt, and waiting for Henderson to bypass the mandatory notary requirements, I was sitting in a secure briefing room at the federal building. I explained that my personal encrypted server suddenly flashed with a critical Title 18 banking violation alert regarding the property under my administration. I detailed exactly how his untouchable bank insider triggered that massive federal alert. I explained that Henderson was foolish enough to try and structure the $500,000 equity line into a series of smaller fragmented offshore wire transfers. He deliberately attempted to keep each individual transaction just under the $10,000 reporting threshold to avoid an automatic Internal Revenue Service audit. I smiled sharply and informed Cameron that structuring is the most basic amateur money laundering tactic in the financial world, and it instantly tripped the automated surveillance grid I had personally coded to protect my blind trust. Cameron's eyes darted wildly across the screen, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as the technical reality of his failure began to crash down on him. But he still tried to fight it, stammering that Henderson was far too smart to get caught by an automated computer system. I pressed a single key, closing the financial ledger and opening a secured law enforcement portal. I told Cameron that Henderson was not a financial mastermind at all. He was just a desperate, pathetic man drowning in the exact same illegal sports betting syndicate debt as my brother. I explained that my forensic team only needed 2 hours to completely dissect Henderson's personal offshore accounts, linking his highly suspicious cash deposits directly to the same violent loan sharks that had been threatening to shatter Cameron's kneecaps. A high-definition image loaded onto my screen, and I pushed the laptop an inch closer to my brother. It was an official federal booking photo. I watched the last drop of hope evaporate from Cameron's eyes as he stared at the mugshot of his supposedly untouchable bank insider. Henderson was not wearing his tailored, expensive designer suit. He was wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, looking hollow, defeated, and utterly terrified against a cinder-block wall. I informed Cameron that the digital arrest warrant was executed by a federal tactical team at 3:15 this afternoon. Henderson was dragged out of his corner office in handcuffs in front of his entire staff, and he had spent the last 4 hours in a downtown interrogation room, happily trading my brother's name for a reduced prison sentence. Jasmine, who had been listening to this entire exchange while pinned between two patrol officers, let out a shrill, mocking laugh. She looked at her husband with absolute, unmasked disgust. She shouted that Cameron was the biggest failure she had ever met, screaming that he could not even successfully rob his own family without leaving a massive trail of evidence. She viciously berated him for promising her that the house equity would pay for a luxury vacation condo and fund her new life, realizing now that she had tied herself to a sinking ship that was dragging her straight to a federal penitentiary. Cameron ignored her screaming. His hands were trembling so violently that he could barely reach into his trouser pocket. He pulled out his own smartphone, his thumb swiping frantically across the cracked glass as he opened his personal banking application. He was desperate to see the massive influx of cash, praying that somehow, some way, Henderson had managed to push the loan approval through before the federal agents breached the bank doors. He typed his password, his breath hitching in his throat as the loading icon spun. He stared at the bright white screen of his phone. He expected to see a $500,000 safety net that would pay off the violent syndicate enforcers who were expecting their money by midnight tonight. Instead, he saw absolutely nothing. His checking account balance read exactly $12.50. Right below his meager balance was a glaring bold red notification spanning the entire width of his screen. It read, "Account frozen by federal order." I closed my laptop with a definitive sharp snap that made Cameron physically flinch. I looked my brother dead in the eye and delivered the crushing reality that shattered his entire world. I calmly informed him that the money he thought he secured from the fake mortgage was never actually transferred to his accounts. I explained that the exact moment Henderson hit the final approval key on the fraudulent loan, my task force intercepted the digital handshake and quarantined the funds in a secure federal clearinghouse. I told Cameron that the massive payout he promised the loan sharks simply does not exist, and the dangerous men he owes are not the type to accept a federal indictment as a valid excuse for a missed payment. Jasmine stared at me, the blood completely gone from her face. The crushing weight of the federal charges had finally broken through her arrogant armor. She realized that she had just voluntarily handed me a wire fraud confession on a silver platter. But Jasmine was a survivor, a manipulator who always believed she could cry her way out of any consequence. She immediately dropped her aggressive, combative posture. Her shoulders slumped, her voice started to quiver, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She turned toward Officer Davies, clasping her hands together as if praying for mercy. She cried out that she was just a terrified wife trapped in a nightmare. She spun a pathetic story about systemic pressure, claiming she was a helpless victim of Cameron's vicious gambling addiction. She wailed that she lived in constant fear of the violent loan sharks knocking on her door, forcing her to go along with the bank fraud just to keep her family safe. She even looked at me, trying to appeal to some twisted sense of female solidarity, sobbing that she was just doing whatever it took to survive a desperate situation created by a reckless man. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I looked at her fake tears and felt absolutely nothing but disgust. I stepped closer, my voice echoing through the quiet lobby, as I systematically dismantled every single lie she just told. I told her to stop insulting the intelligence of everyone in the room. I pointed out that a terrified hostage does not demand a $15,000 diamond bracelet for her birthday from the very father-in-law she claims to be protecting. I reminded her of the last 2 years she spent living completely rent-free in my father's house. I detailed how she ate his groceries, used his utilities, and constantly bullied a 68-year-old man into paying for her luxury spa treatments while she complained that his furniture was outdated. I looked around at the police officers and explained how Jasmine had systematically isolated my father, screaming at him if he dared to leave a coffee cup in the sink, treating him like a burden in the very home he worked 40 years to pay for. I stared directly into Jasmine's panicked eyes and told her she was never a victim. She was a willing, eager parasite who saw an aging man's life savings as her own personal piggy bank to fund a lifestyle she could never actually afford on her own. Cameron was still leaning heavily against the booking desk, breathing rapidly as he processed his wife's failed performance. He tried to interject, stammering that regardless of her spending habits, they still had the $400,000 they wired out of the retirement account. He clung to the desperate delusion that even if they were caught, they had successfully hidden the cash offshore to pay off the syndicate. He tried to bargain with me, right there in the police station, offering to return whatever was left of the money if I just dropped the federal investigation. He foolishly thought he still held some kind of leverage because he controlled the stolen funds. I closed my laptop and let out a genuine, satisfied laugh. I turned to my brother and delivered the psychological blow that completely shattered his reality. I asked him if he honestly believed a senior federal financial investigator would leave her own father's life savings sitting in a vulnerable, easily accessible commercial bank account while a degenerate gambler lived down the hall. Cameron's eyes widened in sheer panic as he realized what I was implying. His mouth opened, but he could not form a single word as the truth began to set in. I calmly informed them both that the $400,000 they meticulously drained from that account over the past 3 weeks was not my father's real retirement fund. I explained that 3 years ago, the exact same day, I put the house into a blind trust. I also moved every single penny of Thomas's actual life savings into a highly secure federally insured wealth management portfolio that Cameron could never even find, let alone access. I watched Cameron's chest heave as he struggled to breathe. I told my brother that the account he hacked into was nothing more than a honeypot. It was a digital trap explicitly funded and monitored by the Internal Revenue Service. I revealed that my federal task force knew about his ties to the underground betting syndicate for months. We needed a clean, undeniable way to track how the loan sharks were laundering their money through offshore accounts. I smiled as I watched the utter devastation wash over my brother and sister-in-law. I told them they did not steal an old man's retirement. They took federal bait. I explained that every single wire transfer they authorized was tagged, traced, and logged by the federal government. They had done all the heavy lifting for us, providing my task force with the exact financial map we needed to dismantle the entire criminal syndicate. Cameron and Jasmine had just handed the federal government the keys to a massive money laundering operation, and they had documented their own guilt every step of the way. The silence in the precinct lobby was absolute. Officer Davies stood completely paralyzed behind the booking desk. He had spent the last 2 hours dealing with what he thought was a standard, albeit messy, suburban domestic dispute. Now he was standing at ground zero of a massive multi-million-dollar federal money laundering and wire fraud conspiracy. The young cop looked at the high-definition footage frozen on the monitor, then looked down at the glowing forensic database on my laptop. He slowly reached down and unclipped the heavy police radio from his tactical belt. His voice shook slightly as he pressed the transmission button, calling directly into his dispatch center to formally request immediate federal backup. He explicitly stated over the open radio channel that local jurisdiction was being relinquished to the United States government. The crackle of the police radio dispatcher, confirming the request, echoed through the room like a death sentence. The sheer finality of that radio call completely broke my brother. The arrogant, slick-talking man who had strutted into the police station demanding our father be locked in a psychiatric ward vanished entirely. Cameron let out a strangled, pathetic sob. His legs literally gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto the hard concrete floor of the precinct, his tailored dress pants soaking up the dirt and grime. He scrambled forward on his knees, reaching out with trembling, sweaty hands to grab the hem of my winter trench coat. He looked up at me, his face twisted in absolute terror, tears and sweat pouring down his cheeks. He started begging, his voice cracking as he pleaded for mercy. He screamed that I could not do this to him, that I could not send my own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary. He frantically tried to play the family card, using every single ounce of emotional manipulation he had left in his arsenal. He reminded me that we grew up under the exact same roof, that we shared the same parents, and that we were supposed to protect each other against the rest of the world. He cried out that a sister does not destroy her brother's life over a simple mistake. He begged me to pick up my phone, call my task force, and call off the federal trap. He swore on his life that he would pay back every single cent of the money if I just gave him one more chance to make things right. I looked down at the pathetic weeping man clinging to my coat. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel compassion, and I certainly did not feel any familial obligation. I simply stared at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as ice. I let him beg. I let him cry in front of the entire police station so that every single officer in the room could see the absolute cowardice of a man who was perfectly willing to hospitalize his own father just an hour ago. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, I stepped back, forcing his hands to slip off my coat. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring my words carried absolute authority. I told Cameron to stop insulting my intelligence by using the word family as a shield for his criminal behavior. I asked him if he remembered what happened the summer I turned 18. I watched his tear-stained face freeze, panic flashing in his eyes as he realized exactly what memory I was bringing into the light. I turned to the police officers and told them the exact origin story of my brother's entitlement. I explained that when I was a teenager, I worked brutal, exhausting shifts at a local diner and a retail store, saving every single dollar I earned to pay for my freshman year of college. I had kept that money in a shared family savings account, believing it was perfectly safe. I looked back down at Cameron and reminded him of the morning I went to the bank to request the cashier's check for my tuition, only to discover the account had been completely emptied. I detailed how my brother, who was already chasing a flashy lifestyle to impress people who did not care about him, had secretly drained my entire college fund. He used my blood, sweat, and tears as a cash down payment on a ridiculous, overpriced sports car. I told the room how I came home crying, begging him to return the car so I could go to school, and how he simply laughed in my face. He had tossed me the keys to his old broken-down sedan and told me to get a loan because his image was more important than my education. I told Cameron that his theft did not destroy me. It fueled me. I explained that because of his greed, I had to work 3 brutal, bone-crushing jobs just to put myself through university. I studied late into the night, fueled by pure exhaustion and burning resentment, determined to learn everything there was to know about financial systems so no one could ever steal from me again. I informed him that his betrayal was the exact catalyst that forged me into a ruthless federal financial investigator. He created the very weapon that was currently destroying his life. Cameron stared at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, utterly defeated by the weight of his own past sins. He knew there was no argument he could make. There was no apology that could erase the decades of selfishness that had led him to this exact moment on the precinct floor. I leaned down, slightly lowering my voice so he could hear the absolute finality of my decision. I told him that we stopped being family the very day he decided my future was his personal piggy bank to steal from. I stated clearly that tonight was not a family dispute, and it was certainly not a tragic misunderstanding. Today is just the day the bill finally comes due. The echo of my final words hung in the stale precinct air, freezing my brother right where he knelt on the dirty linoleum floor. He stared up at me with completely hollow eyes, finally realizing that no amount of crying or playing the family card was going to save him from the federal machine he had just triggered. Before Cameron could even attempt to formulate another pathetic excuse, the heavy double doors at the front of the police station swung violently open. The sudden blast of freezing Chicago night air swept through the lobby, and right behind it walked 2 tall men wearing immaculate dark suits and matching winter overcoats. They moved with absolute synchronized purpose, their heavy footsteps drawing the immediate attention of every single local cop in the room. They did not pause at the waiting area or ask for directions. They marched straight past the metal detector and walked directly up to the main booking desk where Officer Davies was standing. Without saying a single word, they reached into their breast pockets and slapped their gold federal badges onto the counter right next to mine. They were Special Agent Reynolds and Special Agent Mitchell from my exact financial task force, and they had just arrived to officially take out the trash. Officer Davies looked at the 2 federal agents, looked down at their matching credentials, and let out a long, highly relieved exhale. He did not argue about local jurisdiction, and he certainly did not try to protect his precinct's authority over the arrest. He simply took a massive step backward, raised both his hands in the air, and formally announced that the local police department was officially relinquishing all control of the suspects and the crime scene to the United States government. The sheer speed at which the local cops backed away from the situation made the blood completely drain from Jasmine's face. She watched in absolute terror as Special Agent Reynolds pulled a fresh pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt and walked directly toward her. Jasmine instantly snapped out of her frozen shock and went into full-blown survival mode. She started violently thrashing her shoulders, screaming at the top of her lungs that she knew her civil rights, and that this was a completely illegal detainment. She shrieked that she was being unlawfully targeted, demanding to speak to the local watch commander and threatening to sue the entire police department for allowing rogue federal agents to harass an innocent woman without a proper warrant. Neither of the federal agents even blinked at her explosive theatrical tantrum. They were seasoned men who spent their careers taking down cartel money launderers and corrupt hedge fund billionaires, so the shrieking of a suburban fraudster did not even register on their radar. Special Agent Reynolds maintained a completely stone-faced expression as he grabbed Jasmine by the wrist, effortlessly overpowering her frantic struggling. He spun her around, pinned her arms firmly behind her back, and locked the steel cuffs securely around her wrists with a sharp clicking sound that echoed across the quiet room. He calmly advised her to stop resisting a federal arrest immediately unless she wanted an assaulting a federal officer charge added to her rapidly growing list of severe felonies. Jasmine let out a furious, high-pitched scream, twisting her head to glare at me with pure venom. She shouted that I had orchestrated this entire setup just because I was jealous of her perfect marriage and her luxurious lifestyle. I did not even dignify her desperate, unhinged accusation with a response. Instead, I turned my attention to Special Agent Mitchell, who had just set a massive, incredibly thick leather binder down on the precinct counter. The binder landed with a heavy, ominous thud that made Cameron physically jump. He was still kneeling on the floor, staring at the thick spine of the binder as if it were a loaded weapon ready to fire. I stepped forward, resting my hand flat on the cool leather cover. I looked down at my brother and told him that my federal task force does not just look at a single suspicious bank transfer and call it a day. I explained that when we audit a suspect, we strip their entire financial history down to the absolute bare studs. I flipped the heavy binder open, revealing hundreds of pages of highlighted bank records, digital signatures, credit inquiry logs, and meticulously organized financial statements. I informed Cameron and Jasmine that we did not just track the fake retirement honeypot account or the fraudulent secondary mortgage they tried to secure through their corrupt banker earlier that afternoon. I told them that my forensic team had spent the last 48 hours pulling every single financial thread attached to their names. I turned the heavy binder around so they could see the sheer staggering volume of evidence stacked against them. I delivered the crushing reality that we had uncovered a massive, sprawling web of secret credit cards, retail accounts, and high-interest personal loans that they had secretly opened, using my father's Social Security number over the past 5 years. They had not just tried to steal his house today. They had systematically and maliciously destroyed his entire credit score to fund their luxury lifestyle long before I ever installed a single hidden security camera. The shock on Cameron's face deepened into absolute despair as he realized the depth of the federal probe. I told them that identity theft of a senior citizen was a completely separate federal crime, and they had just handed us a half-decade of paper trails proving their guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. The heavy silence in the precinct broke the exact moment I mentioned the words identity theft. Jasmine, even with her arms pinned firmly behind her back and her wrists locked in cold steel handcuffs, proved that her arrogance knew absolutely no bounds. She violently twisted her shoulders, glaring at Special Agent Mitchell and the massive leather binder resting on the booking desk. She let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed uncomfortably against the concrete walls of the police station. She looked directly at me and told the entire room that I was reaching for straws because my so-called federal investigation was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of family caregiving. Jasmine began to weave a brand new, highly calculated narrative right there on the spot. She announced to the federal agents and the lingering local police officers that taking care of an elderly declining man was an incredibly expensive and overwhelming burden. She claimed that when my father moved into the house with them, they were forced to merge their finances just to keep the lights on and put food on the table. She loudly insisted that opening various credit cards and retail accounts in his name was a perfectly legal and entirely necessary step to manage his soaring household expenses. She painted a vivid picture of herself as a selfless, exhausted caretaker who was just trying to buy groceries, pay for astronomical heating bills, and cover the enormous costs of his daily medical needs. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin in absolute defiance, and stared me down. She challenged me to prove otherwise. She practically yelled that mixing family funds under one roof was not a federal crime, and she dared my task force to find a single shred of evidence proving she used those specific credit cards for her own personal gain. She was banking entirely on the assumption that 5 years of financial records would be a tangled, messy web of shared domestic expenses that no accountant could ever clearly separate. She smiled broadly, genuinely, believing she had just created a gray area massive enough to cast reasonable doubt on the entire identity theft charge, essentially trying to hide her grand theft behind the messy reality of suburban life. I did not interrupt her. I let her spin her desperate web of lies until she completely ran out of breath. Special Agent Reynolds and Special Agent Mitchell did not say a word either. They simply stepped back and allowed me to take the floor, knowing exactly what was coming next. I turned back to the precinct counter and opened my laptop. I told Jasmine that she clearly had no idea what a senior forensic accountant actually does for a living. I explained that I do not just look at total balances, arbitrary minimum monthly payments, or vague ledger summaries. I track the exact microscopic narrative of every single dollar that moves through the digital banking system. I grabbed the casting cable connected to the precinct's main wall monitor and plugged it directly back into my federal database. The large television screen above the booking desk flared to life instantly. I did not show them a confusing spreadsheet or a dense, unreadable wall of numbers. I projected the actual itemized monthly statements from those secret credit cards directly onto the screen for everyone in the lobby to read. The high-definition text was impossible to ignore. I pointed to the very first highlighted transaction from 2 years ago. I read it out loud so there could be no misunderstanding. It was a charge for $22,000 paid to a luxury European airline for 2 first-class round-trip tickets to Paris, accompanied by a corresponding charge for a 5-star romantic boutique hotel overlooking the Eiffel Tower. Cameron, who was still slumped on the floor, suddenly jerked his head up. His eyes widened in sheer disbelief as he stared at the Paris charges. He had been drowning in violent syndicate debt for years, terrified for his life, and he was just now realizing that his wife had been secretly funding luxury European vacations behind his back, using the very same stolen credit she claimed was keeping them afloat. I hit the down arrow on my keyboard, scrolling to the next highlighted page on the massive monitor. I pointed to a $15,000 charge authorized at an exclusive appointment-only jewelry boutique in Beverly Hills. The itemized receipt clearly described the purchase of a custom handcrafted diamond tennis bracelet. I scrolled down one more time, bringing up the most damning charge of all. It was a massive direct wire transfer of $28,000 to a highly discreet upscale plastic surgery clinic located in downtown Chicago. I turned away from the screen and looked directly into Jasmine's horrified eyes. The smug, arrogant smile had completely vanished from her face, replaced by the paralyzing terror of a criminal who had just been caught red-handed with no possible way out. I kept my voice perfectly steady, making sure every single police officer and federal agent heard the absolute finality of my words. I told Jasmine that my father is a 68-year-old retired steelworker suffering from severe chronic arthritis in both of his knees. I stated clearly that the man has not owned a passport in 2 decades and has not left the state of Illinois in over 10 years. I asked her to explain to the federal agents how an elderly man who can barely walk up a flight of stairs needed 2 first-class tickets to France for his daily medical care. I asked her to justify how a $15,000 diamond tennis bracelet kept the winter heating bills paid. Finally, I demanded she explain to the room why my father would ever need to wire $28,000 to a high-end cosmetic surgeon. I told her that those were not household expenses. They were the undeniable itemized receipts of her own boundless vanity, paid for with the stolen identity of a good man. I informed her that she did not just blur the lines of family finances. She had committed textbook systematic financial abuse against a vulnerable senior citizen. As the local cops shook their heads in disgust and the federal agents tightened their grip on her arms, I told Jasmine that those specific charges were the exact pieces of evidence that would guarantee her a very long, very bleak stay in a federal prison cell. Jasmine stood completely frozen under the harsh precinct lights, the absolute reality of her vanity being broadcast to a room full of federal agents, finally silencing her. She had tried to hide her grand theft behind the messy reality of suburban caregiving, and I had just publicly humiliated her with the undeniable itemized receipts of her own greed. As Special Agent Mitchell tightened his grip on her handcuffed wrists, it became painfully clear that her fabricated narrative was dead. There was no gray area left to exploit. She was going to federal prison for robbing a senior citizen to fund her plastic surgery and European vacations. Seeing his wife utterly defeated and knowing his own financial defense had been incinerated, Cameron decided to pivot to a completely different survival strategy. He knew they were facing massive criminal charges, but his immediate desperate priority was simply avoiding a cold jail cell for the night. He straightened his ruined, sweat-stained dress shirt, wiped his face, and took a step away from Jasmine, trying to project an air of calm defiance. He looked directly at Officer Davies, then shifted his gaze to Special Agent Reynolds, and loudly declared that regardless of whatever ridiculous financial accusations my task force was throwing at them, they were still legally entitled to their basic civil rights. Cameron announced to the entire police station that he and his wife were going home. He arrogantly cited Illinois state tenancy laws, explaining that they had lived in my father's house for over 2 years. They received their daily mail there. Their driver licenses listed the address, and all their personal belongings were inside. He boldly claimed squatters' rights and established legal residency, insisting that no law enforcement officer in the building had the authority to put them out on the street in the middle of a freezing Chicago night. He actually smirked at me, his confidence returning for a brief, sickening moment. He thought he had found the ultimate unbreakable loophole to buy them time. He pointed a finger at my chest and told me that even if I was the legal owner of the property through a blind trust, I could not bypass the local housing courts. He boasted that a formal eviction in this county takes at least 90 days and sometimes up to 6 months if the tenants decide to fight it with a decent lawyer. Cameron proudly declared that he and Jasmine would be sleeping in their comfortable king-sized bed tonight. He bragged that they would spend the next several months living rent-free in the very house I claimed to own, using that time to liquidate their hidden assets and hire a top-tier defense attorney to crush my federal investigation. He even had the audacity to demand that the local police provide them with an escort back to the property to ensure I did not try to illegally lock them out. I did not get angry. I did not raise my voice to debate local real estate statutes with a degenerate gambler who is currently facing decades behind bars. I simply looked at Special Agent Reynolds, who gave me a slow, highly satisfied nod. I turned back to the precinct counter, unlatched the side compartment of my leather briefcase, and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. The front of the package bore the unmistakable embossed gold seal of the United States Department of the Treasury. I walked directly up to my brother, slapping the heavy envelope against his chest and forcing him to grab it before it hit the floor. I kept my voice perfectly even as I told him that he was absolutely right about local tenancy laws. I agreed that a standard civilian landlord cannot kick a legal tenant out onto the street without a lengthy, drawn-out court process and a formal eviction notice signed by a county judge. I watched his arrogant smirk widen for a fraction of a second before I completely obliterated his entire reality. I told Cameron to look very closely at the seal on the envelope he was holding. I informed him that I was not acting as his landlord tonight, and I certainly did not waste my time filing a standard eviction notice at the local county courthouse. I stated clearly that the document currently resting in his hands was an immediate order of property seizure and civil asset forfeiture signed explicitly by a federal magistrate judge. I explained that standard housing protection laws only apply to normal law-abiding citizens, not to people who actively operate a criminal enterprise out of a residential neighborhood. Cameron's smirk instantly vanished. The color drained from his face as his hands began to tremble against the heavy envelope. I did not give him a single second to process the disaster before breaking down the exact legal nightmare he had just brought upon himself. I explained that because he and Jasmine had utilized the home internet network, the residential address, and their specific bedrooms to execute massive wire fraud, launder stolen money, and forge federal banking documents, the house was no longer legally classified as a simple domestic residence. I leaned in closer, making sure he heard every single word I said. I told him that those specific rooms were now classified as active restricted federal crime scenes. I informed my brother that while he was busy arguing in the police station, federal evidence recovery teams had already descended upon the property. I revealed that tactical agents had already changed the locks, boarded the access doors, and confiscated every single item inside their bedrooms, including their computers, their personal safes, and their financial records as direct evidence of a federal conspiracy. I looked at Cameron and Jasmine and delivered the final crushing blow that destroyed their last remaining illusion of comfort. I told them that they were not going back to their warm king-sized bed. They were not going back to collect their designer clothes or their toothbrushes. I informed them that the federal government had completely locked down the premises, and they were legally and permanently barred from ever stepping foot on that property for the rest of their lives. The absolute finality of my words hung in the sterile air of the police precinct, completely shattering the last fragile delusion my brother and his wife had clung to. Jasmine stood frozen, her eyes wide and bloodshot, as her brain desperately tried to process the fact that she was entirely homeless. The sprawling suburban house she had treated like her own personal castle, the custom closets filled with clothes bought with my father's stolen money, the expensive furniture she had bullied him into purchasing, everything was gone. It was sealed behind federal crime scene tape, guarded by armed tactical agents who would arrest her on sight if she even stepped onto the driveway. A guttural, horrifying sound erupted from the back of Jasmine's throat. It was not a cry of sorrow, but a visceral scream of sheer entitlement being violently ripped away. She began thrashing against the tight grip of the federal agents holding her arms behind her back. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding to know where she was supposed to sleep tonight, how she was supposed to survive without access to her daily medications, her skincare routines, or her credit cards. She looked at Cameron, her eyes blazing with absolute hatred, and screamed at him to do something, demanding he act like a man and fix the catastrophic nightmare he had dragged her into. But Cameron was completely useless. He was still staring at the federal seizure notice in his trembling hands, his mind entirely broken by the realization that he could not even return home to pack a single bag. Realizing her husband was completely paralyzed by fear. Jasmine's panic instantly warped back into blistering, arrogant rage. If the house was truly gone, she decided to fall back on the one thing she believed made her invincible. She turned her furious gaze back to me, her chest heaving as she lifted her chin in a pathetic display of superiority. She loudly declared that losing the house did not matter because they did not need my father's pathetic real estate to crush me in court. She boasted to the entire precinct lobby that she and Cameron still possessed millions of dollars in untraceable offshore assets, high-yield investment portfolios, and massive collections of physical luxury goods. She demanded that Special Agent Reynolds immediately release his grip on her and fetch her designer handbag resting on the booking counter. She ordered him to hand over her smartphone, proudly announcing that she was going to use her one phone call to hire the most ruthless, expensive, high-profile defense attorney in the state of Illinois. She sneered at me, her voice dripping with venom, promising that she would bury my task force in endless, suffocating litigation. She threatened to drag my name through the mud, sue the federal government for civil rights violations, and walk out of a federal courthouse completely exonerated while my career burned to the ground. She painted a vivid, arrogant picture of a prolonged legal war entirely funded by her deep, bottomless pockets. Special Agent Reynolds did not flinch at her screaming threats. He did not release her arms, and he certainly did not hand her the smartphone. Instead, he gave a slight nod to Special Agent Mitchell, who calmly stepped up to the metal booking counter where Jasmine's expensive designer handbag was resting. Mitchell did not handle the bag with the reverence Jasmine believed it deserved. He unceremoniously grabbed the leather handles, turned the bag completely upside down, and dumped the entire contents directly onto the hard metal counter. Her expensive smartphone, a thick stack of platinum credit cards, a heavy set of keys to her brand new luxury SUV, and a designer wallet scattered loudly across the desk. Jasmine shrieked violently, demanding that the federal agent stop touching her personal property, accusing him of illegal search and seizure without a warrant. Special Agent Mitchell completely ignored her frantic yelling. He pulled a thick, transparent federal evidence bag from his coat pocket and began methodically sweeping every single item from the counter directly into the plastic pouch. He then turned his cold, unblinking gaze directly onto Jasmine. He stepped into her personal space, commanding her to hold entirely still. With practiced mechanical efficiency, he reached down and unclasped the heavy custom diamond tennis bracelet from her right wrist. He then grabbed her left hand and forcefully slid the massive glittering diamond engagement ring right off her finger. Jasmine went absolutely feral. She kicked her expensive boots against the concrete floor, screaming that she was being actively robbed by corrupt police officers inside a police station. She wailed that her jewelry was sacred personal property and that removing it was a massive violation of her constitutional rights. Special Agent Mitchell did not even blink at her outrage. He simply dropped her diamonds into the evidence bag, sealed it tight with red tamper-proof tape, and turned his attention to my brother. He grabbed Cameron by the wrist, flipping his arm over to expose the massive $40,000 imported luxury watch Cameron wore like a badge of honor. Mitchell unbuckled the heavy timepiece, slipping it off my brother's wrist, while Cameron whimpered in pathetic protest. Jasmine continued to scream, demanding to know under what possible legal authority they were stripping her of her personal wealth. I stepped forward perfectly calm and delivered the exact legal reality that silenced her screaming permanently. I informed my sister-in-law that under federal law, any physical assets, luxury items, or vehicles purchased with or derived from the direct proceeds of wire fraud, elder abuse, and money laundering are subject to immediate civil asset forfeiture. I looked at the heavy evidence bag resting on the counter and reminded Jasmine of the brilliant confession she had voluntarily given to the entire room just 20 minutes earlier. I explained that when she proudly screamed about forcing Cameron to transfer $100,000 of stolen retirement money into her personal account to buy her car, her bags, and her jewelry, she literally provided the exact probable cause the federal government needed to seize them on the spot. She had legally confessed that every single piece of luxury she was wearing was the direct fruit of a federal crime. I then leaned in close, ensuring the golden couple heard the final nail in their financial coffin. I told Jasmine that she could stop bragging about the offshore accounts she planned to use to hire her high-priced defense attorney. I explained that the exact moment my task force intercepted the fake mortgage approval, the Treasury Department simultaneously froze every single domestic and international bank account bearing their names. They stood there under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the precinct lobby, physically stripped of every single status symbol they had used to elevate themselves above my father. The diamonds, the watch, the car keys, and the designer bag were all locked inside a plastic federal evidence pouch. They were completely broke, entirely homeless, and wearing the only clothes they were legally allowed to keep. The arrogant, wealthy couple who had walked into the police station expecting to ruin an innocent old man had been reduced to absolute, undeniable zero. The cold, biting reality of her bare hands finally seemed to short-circuit my sister-in-law's brain. Jasmine stared down at her fingers, the faint red indentations on her skin, the only remaining evidence that she had ever worn a massive diamond engagement ring. Stripped of her luxury watch, her designer handbag, and her expensive smartphone, the armor of extreme wealth she had worn into the precinct was completely gone. She looked up at Special Agent Mitchell, but she quickly realized that screaming at seasoned federal agents was entirely useless. They were standing there like statues carved from granite, completely immune to her shrill demands. Seeing that the federal wall was impenetrable, Jasmine did what every cornered manipulative predator does. She desperately searched the room for a softer, more gullible target. She violently twisted her body, turning her back on the federal agents, and locked her wild, bloodshot eyes onto the local police officers and the handful of late-night civilians sitting in the precinct waiting area. If she could not intimidate her way out of federal custody, she was going to burn the entire room down with optics. Jasmine took a deep, shuddering breath and completely changed her performance. She let out a piercing theatrical wail and began shouting at the top of her lungs about massive civil rights violations. She aggressively played the race and gender card, screaming to the stunned lobby that she was a highly successful self-made African American woman who was being systemically and unlawfully targeted by a completely corrupt system. She pointed her cuffed hands in my direction, her voice echoing off the concrete walls as she spun a brand new, incredibly dangerous narrative. Jasmine shrieked to the local cops that I was not conducting a legitimate financial investigation. She claimed I was just a bitter, deeply jealous sister who was abusing my federal authority to execute a personal vendetta against my brother's beautiful, wealthy wife. She screamed that this entire night was an illegal rogue operation designed to strip a minority woman of her hard-earned assets without a single shred of due process. She begged the local patrol officers to intervene, shouting that they were just standing there letting federal agents trample all over their local jurisdiction and violate her basic human rights right in their own lobby. I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed, watching her attempt to incite a literal riot in the middle of a police station. I did not interrupt her because I knew exactly what she was trying to do. Jasmine was deliberately manufacturing pure, unadulterated chaos. She yelled at the civilians sitting on the wooden waiting benches, begging them to pull out their cell phones and start recording. She shrieked about police brutality, claiming she was being physically assaulted and robbed of her jewelry by rogue government agents. She whipped her head around wildly, trying to create an atmosphere of panic and confusion, preying on the deep-seated fears of institutional corruption that make people inherently distrustful of law enforcement. For a terrifying split second, her manipulation actually started to work. A heavy tension fell over the room. Two civilians in the waiting area slowly reached into their pockets and pulled out their phones, unsure of what they were witnessing, but ready to hit record. The local patrol officers shifted uncomfortably on their feet, exchanging nervous glances. In the modern era of viral videos and public backlash, the absolute last thing any local cop wants is to be caught on camera, standing by during a high-profile civil rights violation. The atmosphere in the lobby became thick, distracted, and highly volatile. Jasmine saw that microscopic window of hesitation, and she seized it with the instincts of a desperate animal. While every single pair of eyes in the room was focused on the tension between the federal agents and the nervous local cops, Jasmine began to subtly shuffle backward. Her hands were locked tightly behind her back, but her legs worked perfectly fine. She used the echoes of her own screaming to mask the sound of her expensive boots retreating across the linoleum floor. She kept her face turned toward me, continuing to shout about illegal search and seizure, all while inching closer and closer to the front of the building. She spotted her exit. The heavy glass double doors of the precinct were only 10 feet away from her. I could see the exact moment the desperate calculation clicked in her head. She truly believed that if she could just slip out those doors and disappear into the freezing, chaotic sprawl of the Chicago night, she could find a payphone, contact someone from her old life, and vanish before the federal arrest paperwork was fully processed. She thought she had successfully weaponized social optics to blind everyone in the room. Jasmine stopped screaming, spun around on her heels, and made a sudden explosive dash for the front doors. She sprinted with everything she had, her cuffed hands throwing her balance off but adrenaline pushing her forward. She was mere inches away from the exit. She could actually see the swirling snow outside under the harsh yellow streetlights. She threw her shoulder forward, bracing to slam into the push bar of the glass door to secure her freedom. But she never hit the glass. A massive dark blue uniform stepped directly into the doorframe, entirely blocking her path. Jasmine crashed hard into a solid wall of Kevlar, and police issued tactical gear, the impact knocking her backward. She stumbled, gasping for air, and looked up into the furious, unyielding face of Officer Davies. This was not the same pale, stammering rookie desk cop who had been intimidated by my federal badge an hour ago, and he was certainly not the gullible officer she had easily manipulated with her fake tears when I first walked in. Officer Davies looked down at her with absolute unfiltered disgust. He had just watched the high-definition video of this exact woman brutally attacking an innocent, bleeding elderly man from behind, and he was completely done being used as a pawn in her sick, twisted games. Officer Davies reached out with one massive hand and slammed the heavy glass door completely shut, the deadbolt clicking into place with a loud final thud. He planted his boots firmly on the floor, crossed his arms over his chest, and looked Jasmine dead in the eye. He did not care about her screaming, he did not care about the cell phones in the lobby, and he did not care about her fake victim routine. He leaned down, his voice echoing with absolute local authority, and delivered the reality check that permanently shattered her escape plan. He told her that playing the victim card on television might work for some people, but it does not work when there is 4K video evidence of her trying to cave an old man's skull in. Officer Davies stepped forward, backing her right up against the cold glass, and told her that she hit an old man with a bat, and she was not going anywhere. The heavy thud of the glass door closing echoed through the precinct lobby, snapping the last thread of chaotic energy Jasmine had tried to weave. Officer Davies stood like an impenetrable fortress, physically blocking her only route to freedom. When the local patrol officers realized the desperate trick Jasmine had just attempted, any hesitation, they felt completely vanished. Two officers stepped forward immediately, taking firm hold of her handcuffed arms and dragging her away from the door. The civilians in the waiting area, realizing they were not witnessing a civil rights violation, but the failed escape of a violent criminal, slowly lowered their cell phones and returned to their seats. The manufactured riot was completely dead, and Jasmine was dragged back toward the booking desk, her head hanging low in absolute undeniable defeat. Cameron watched his wife's escape attempt fail from his position on the dirty linoleum floor. He watched the federal agents turn their cold, unblinking attention back to him, and he finally understood that the federal machine was moving forward with or without his cooperation. There were no more distractions left. There was no more stolen equity to hide behind, no high-priced lawyers rushing to save them, and no loopholes left to exploit. The sheer weight of the mandatory minimum sentences for federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and elder abuse crashed down onto his shoulders. Cameron completely disintegrated. He did not try to stand up and face the agents like a man. He did not try to offer a defense. He fell forward onto his hands and knees, burying his face in his palms, and began to weep uncontrollably. The sound of his sobbing was loud, pathetic, and agonizing to listen to. He scrambled forward on his knees, his expensive tailored trousers soaking up the dirt and grime from the precinct floor, crawling directly toward the metal bench where our father was sitting. He lunged forward and grabbed onto my father's knees, clutching the fabric of Thomas's pants with trembling, sweaty hands. Cameron buried his face against my father's legs, his voice cracking and hitching as he launched into the most desperate, manipulative performance of his entire life. He began begging Thomas to save him, pleading with him to call me off and order the federal agents to drop the investigation. Cameron weaponized decades of emotional history right there on the precinct floor. He looked up at Thomas, tears and snot running down his face, and cried out that he was his only son. He frantically reminded our father that he was the one who carried the family name, the one who was supposed to pass on the legacy to the next generation. He wailed that if he became a convicted federal felon, the family name would be ruined forever, and he would never be able to get a job or show his face in their hometown again. When that did not get an immediate reaction, Cameron sank even lower. He brought up our late mother. He sobbed that our mother would be absolutely heartbroken to see her children fighting like this. He told Thomas that she would never have allowed me to send her precious boy to a federal penitentiary. He tried to spin the narrative, pointing a shaking finger at me, and telling our father that I was just a bitter, jealous sister who was using my government badge to settle petty childhood grudges. Cameron then tried to justify the horrific crimes he had committed earlier that evening. He cried that gambling addiction is a recognized disease, claiming his brain was sick and that he needed professional rehabilitation, not a prison cell. He swore on his life that he was just terrified of the violent loan sharks coming to shatter his kneecaps, insisting that the stolen retirement money and the forged mortgage were just acts of sheer blind panic. He looked at the bloody bandage on our father's forehead and swore that he never wanted Jasmine to hurt him, claiming the baseball bat was a terrible accident and that he would never let anyone lay a hand on his dad again. He promised to go to meetings to be a better son, to earn back every single penny, and to do whatever it took to earn forgiveness. I stood a few feet away, my heart pounding violently against my ribs. I kept my face entirely expressionless, but inside a knot of genuine fear began to tighten in my stomach. For 30 years, my father had carried a massive blind spot for Cameron. Every single time my brother failed, every time he racked up unpaid debts, every time he skipped family holidays or disappointed us, Thomas had always found a way to excuse his behavior. Our father had always believed that Cameron just needed one more chance to turn his life around. I watched Thomas stare down at the weeping, pathetic man clinging to his legs, and I braced myself. I waited for my father to look up at me with those soft, tired eyes and ask if there was any possible way we could drop the federal charges and handle this privately. The federal agents watched closely as well, knowing that while the financial crimes were federal, the victim's cooperation always heavily influences the sentencing phase. The silence from my father was heavy and suffocating. Cameron's frantic sobs turned into desperate, gulping hiccups as he waited for his father's saving grace. Thomas slowly raised his hand and touched the thick, blood-soaked bandage on his forehead. He looked over at the trash can where the torn pieces of the fake psychiatric hold I had ripped up earlier were resting. He looked at the high-definition monitor still displaying the exact moment his daughter-in-law swung a metal bat at his skull while his son watched. Thomas slowly reached down and firmly pried Cameron's trembling fingers off his trousers. He pushed himself up from the cold metal bench, standing tall and straight, despite his aching joints and the violent head injury he had sustained. He looked down at Cameron, but there was no pity in his eyes. There was no fatherly warmth, and there was no forgiveness. There was only absolute freezing clarity. My father's voice did not shake as he spoke to the man kneeling on the floor. He told Cameron that he could have forgiven the stolen retirement money. He said he could have even forgiven the secret gambling debts and the terrible lies. But he told his son that he could never ever forgive the fact that he hired a corrupt doctor to declare him insane. He stated that trying to strip away his basic human rights, trying to lock him away in a cold, sterile psychiatric ward for the rest of his life, just to cover up a bank fraud was a level of pure evil he could not even begin to comprehend. Thomas looked at the weeping, pathetic creature on the floor and delivered the final crushing blow that severed their bond for the rest of eternity. You tried to lock me in a psychiatric ward to steal my life. I do not have a son anymore. My father's devastating rejection hung heavily in the cold, stale air of the police precinct. The absolute finality of his words completely shattered whatever remaining fight my brother had left in him. Cameron stayed slumped on his knees, his chin resting against his chest, staring blankly at the dirty linoleum floor as the reality of his isolation finally settled over him. He was entirely alone. There was no more fatherly safety net to catch him, no more family legacy to hide behind, and no more forgiveness to exploit. Special Agent Reynolds and Special Agent Mitchell did not give him a single moment to mourn the bridge he had just burned. They moved forward with synchronized, terrifying precision. Special Agent Reynolds grabbed Cameron by the ruined collar of his expensive dress shirt and hauled him forcefully to his feet. He spun my brother around, pinning his arms firmly behind his back. The sharp metallic ratcheting of heavy steel handcuffs echoed across the lobby for the second time that night, securing Cameron just a few feet away from where Jasmine was already restrained. Special Agent Mitchell stepped squarely in front of the golden couple, holding up his federal badge, and began reciting the Miranda rights. The words were delivered in a flat mechanical tone that carried absolute authority. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. Every single syllable sounded like a heavy iron door slamming shut. Jasmine squeezed her eyes closed, tears of sheer panic ruining her expensive makeup as the federal agents formally processed their arrest. But Cameron, despite being physically restrained and verbally disowned, simply could not turn off the arrogant gambling machinery running inside his head. He had spent his entire adult life bouncing from one catastrophic financial disaster to another, always managing to find a sleazy, underhanded loophole to reset the board. Even now, with his hands cuffed behind his back and a federal agent reading him his rights, his mind was desperately searching for a technicality. Cameron leaned his head slightly toward his wife. His voice was a frantic, hushed whisper, but in the dead silence of the precinct lobby, his desperate plotting was perfectly audible to everyone standing nearby. He told Jasmine to stop crying and pull herself together. He muttered that they just needed to keep their mouths shut until they saw a judge. He confidently whispered that all these grand theft and wire fraud charges were just aggressive intimidation tactics designed to scare them into a quick plea deal. Cameron actually managed to force a pathetic, sickening smirk onto his face as he explained his brilliant survival strategy to his horrified wife. He told Jasmine that the $400,000 they took from the retirement account was ultimately just an unsecured family debt, a civil dispute blown completely out of proportion. He claimed the fraudulent mortgage was a local banking issue that their lawyers could easily tie up in state court for years. His grandmaster plan was to simply declare Chapter 7 bankruptcy the exact second they posted bail. He bragged to his wife that filing for total bankruptcy would trigger an automatic stay, freezing all civil litigation and allowing a state judge to completely wipe their financial slate clean. He whispered that they could legally discharge the stolen money, wash their hands of the massive underground gambling debt, and leave my father holding the bag while they started over fresh. He genuinely believed he had just discovered a magical financial reset button that would save them from decades in prison. I listened to his pathetic, delusional whispering, and I felt a cold surge of absolute satisfaction. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, planting my boots directly in his line of sight, so he was forced to look at me. I stepped right into his personal space, invading the tiny, desperate bubble of false hope he had just constructed. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring my words carried the surgical precision of a seasoned federal investigator. I told my brother that his strategy was genuinely fascinating for someone who had absolutely no understanding of how the federal banking system actually operates. I asked Cameron if he really thought a senior forensic accountant would set a digital trap without ensuring the snare was completely inescapable. I watched the arrogant smirk instantly falter on his lips as I reminded him of the specific nature of the honeypot account they had hacked into. I explained that standard checking accounts and regular savings accounts are indeed subject to standard civil litigation and bankruptcy protections. But I told him to remember exactly what kind of account my father had held his life savings in. It was not a standard ledger. It was a tax-deferred, federally regulated 401k retirement vehicle. The color drained from his face as the financial reality of what he had done began to dawn on him. I leaned in close, making sure he heard every single syllable of his permanent destruction. I explained that when my task force set up that honeypot account, we deliberately left all the federal tax flags active. I told Cameron that when he bypassed the security questions and initiated those massive unauthorized wire transfers to steal the $400,000, he executed a total immediate liquidation of a federally protected retirement asset. Because he stole the money directly through backdoor channels, he completely bypassed the mandatory banking protocols that automatically withhold funds for the government. Jasmine stopped her quiet, sobbing, her head snapping up as she stared at me in absolute horror. I looked directly into my brother's terrified eyes and delivered the ultimate inescapable payoff that completely obliterated his entire existence. You cannot bankrupt out of IRS debt, Cameron. When you stole that $400,000 from the retirement account, you failed to withhold the mandatory early withdrawal penalties and the capital gains taxes. You currently owe the Internal Revenue Service $180,000 in unpaid back taxes, and failure to pay is a completely separate non-dischargeable federal felony. Cameron stopped breathing entirely. His knees buckled and he would have collapsed flat onto the concrete floor if Special Agent Reynolds had not firmly held him up by his biceps. I calmly explained that the Internal Revenue Service does not care about local state judges, and they absolutely do not recognize Chapter 7, bankruptcy filings for criminal tax evasion. I told him that federal tax debt survives everything. It survives bankruptcy, it survives foreclosure, and it will survive him for the rest of his natural life. I smiled as I watched the utter devastation wash over my brother and sister-in-law. I told them that they had not just committed elder abuse and wire fraud. They had actively stolen from the federal government, and the United States Treasury would hunt them to the ends of the earth to collect every single penny. The trap was locked, the key was thrown away, and there was absolutely no loophole left to save them. The sheer crushing weight of that six-figure tax debt slammed into Cameron like a freight train. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, pathetic gasp. For years, he had operated under the arrogant delusion that he was the smartest person in any room, always one clever loophole away from dodging the consequences of his disastrous financial decisions. He had banked his entire survival on the idea of a clean bankruptcy, dreaming of walking out of a state courtroom with a wiped ledger. Now looking up at me, the brutal reality of the Internal Revenue Service shattered that fantasy into dust. He finally understood that the federal government does not forget, does not forgive, and absolutely does not allow criminals to discharge the taxes owed on stolen retirement funds. Jasmine stood a few feet away, her arms still pinned behind her back by Special Agent Mitchell. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically between me and her trembling husband. She had married Cameron specifically for the affluent lifestyle he promised, trading her own morals for designer bags and luxury vehicles. Hearing that they were not just broke, but buried under nearly $200,000 of non-dischargeable federal debt completely broke her mind. The lavish future she had violently fought for, the future she had been willing to hospitalize an elderly man to secure, vanished in a single heartbeat. She realized that even if she somehow survived her prison sentence, she would be walking out of a cell directly into a lifetime of federal wage garnishments. She was financially ruined until the day she died. Special Agent Reynolds did not give my brother another second to wallow in his own self-pity. He hauled Cameron forcefully to his feet, gripping the collar of his ruined, dirt-stained dress shirt. Reynolds tightened his hold on the heavy steel chain connecting the cuffs, forcing Cameron to stand up straight. He looked at my brother with absolute professional disdain and announced that the educational portion of the evening was officially over. It was time for the transport. The order to move snapped the local police officers out of their stunned silence. The entire precinct lobby filled with patrol cops and desk sergeants who had watched this entire saga unfold, stepped back to clear a wide path to the front doors. This was the ultimate bitter irony of the night. Cameron and Jasmine had deliberately driven my father to this specific police station. They had orchestrated this entire scenario, fully expecting to strut out of the building as tragic, heroic victims while my father was dragged away in a straitjacket. Instead, they were the ones being frog-marched across the dirty linoleum floor, their hands bound tightly behind their backs, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The walk toward the exit felt incredibly long under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. I stood beside my father, watching every single step they took. The local officers did not say a word, but their silence was deafening. They stared at this golden couple with unfiltered contempt. Officer Davies, the young cop who had been completely manipulated by Jasmine's fake tears just an hour earlier, marched ahead of the group. He reached the heavy glass double doors and pushed them wide open, holding them back with a firm grip. He looked directly at Jasmine as she was escorted past him, his face a mask of stone, making sure she knew exactly how much he despised her for trying to use his badge to ruin an innocent man. The freezing, Chicago winter wind immediately whipped into the lobby as they were pushed out onto the concrete pavement. Two massive black federal tactical SUVs were idling aggressively at the curb, their heavy tires resting on the snow-covered asphalt. The bright red and blue emergency lights mounted behind the grills were flashing silently, casting harsh alternating shadows across my brother's pale, terrified face. The blast of freezing air seemed to snap whatever remaining restraint Jasmine possessed. The reality of the waiting federal vehicles, the flashing lights, and the absolute destruction of her life pushed her into a state of feral, unhinged rage. As Special Agent Mitchell guided her toward the rear door of the second SUV, Jasmine suddenly stopped fighting the officers and turned her entire fury directly onto her husband. She twisted her neck, glaring at Cameron with a level of hatred so pure it practically burned through the cold night air. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing down the quiet city block. She cursed the exact day she ever met him, shrieking that he was a pathetic, incompetent coward who ruined her entire life. She yelled that he promised her wealth and status, but instead he dragged her into his disgusting, degenerate gambling debts and handed her a massive federal prison sentence. She completely disowned him right there on the sidewalk, shouting that he was a miserable failure who could not even execute a simple bank fraud without leaving a blazing digital trail of evidence for the government to find. Cameron, cornered like a rat and stripped of his pride, finally snapped back. The terrifying reality of his doom erased his usual cowardly silence. He struggled against Special Agent Reynolds, screaming right back at his wife. He roared that she was a greedy, blood-sucking parasite. He yelled that he only got in so deep with the violent loan sharks because she constantly demanded European vacations, diamonds, and luxury cars he could never afford. He blamed her endless vanity for driving him to steal his own father's retirement fund, shouting that she was the one who happily spent the stolen money and violently assaulted an old man just to cover her own tracks. They stood shivering in the snow, two vicious predators completely turning on each other, tearing their toxic marriage to shreds in front of an audience of federal agents and local police. There was no loyalty among thieves. The facade of the wealthy, successful suburban couple was completely dead. Special Agent Mitchell simply shook his head in disgust, grabbed the back of Jasmine's collar, and shoved her forcefully into the back seat of the heavy federal SUV. Special Agent Reynolds did the same to Cameron, pushing him into the opposite side of the reinforced vehicle. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a definitive echoing boom that cut off their screaming instantly. Through the thick, tinted bulletproof glass of the cruiser, I could still see their silhouettes lunging at each other in the back seat, their mouths moving in furious, silent screams as they continued to viciously tear each other apart in the cramped cage. The federal agents climbed into the front seats, put the vehicles in gear, and slowly pulled away from the curb. The SUVs disappeared down the dark, snow-covered street, taking the absolute worst mistakes of my family's history away forever. The heavy glass double doors of the police precinct slowly swung shut, cutting off the bitter chill of the Chicago winter wind. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal tactical vehicles faded into the distance, taking my brother and his wife away to a holding cell where they belonged. Inside the lobby, the chaotic, suffocating energy that had dominated the space for the last 2 hours completely evaporated. The local patrol officers returned to their desks in absolute silence. Officer Davies sat behind the booking counter, staring blankly at his computer screen, clearly still processing the massive federal takedown he had just witnessed in his own station. The adrenaline that had kept my blood pumping and my mind racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour finally began to recede. In its place, a profound, heavy exhaustion settled over my shoulders. I turned away from the front doors and walked back across the scuffed linoleum floor toward the metal bench in the corner. My father Thomas was still sitting exactly where I had left him. The violent storm of arrests, confessions, and federal asset seizures had raged entirely around him, but he looked incredibly small and fragile in the aftermath. A young local paramedic, who had been quietly waiting in the break room until the federal agents cleared the lobby, finally approached with a green medical jump bag slung over her shoulder. She knelt carefully on the floor in front of my father, her voice soft and professional, as she asked for his permission to treat his injuries. I stood silently by his side, watching as she opened a sterile saline packet and began to wipe away the dried blood crusted along his hairline. She worked with gentle precision cleaning the vicious gash on his forehead before applying strong butterfly stitches to close the wound. She wrapped a clean white gauze bandage firmly around his head, checking his pupil dilation with a small penlight to rule out a severe concussion. My father sat perfectly still through the entire medical examination. He did not wince when the antiseptic stung his skin, and he did not complain about the throbbing ache in his skull. His eyes were completely vacant, staring straight through the cinder block wall opposite the bench. The physical pain of the baseball bat was nothing compared to the catastrophic emotional trauma of watching his only son orchestrate his destruction. Once the paramedic finished her assessment, she packed up her supplies, offered a warm, sympathetic smile, and quietly backed away to give us privacy. I pulled up a folding metal chair and sat down directly in front of my father, positioning myself so we were knee to knee. I reached out and gently placed my hands over his weathered, calloused fingers. They were ice cold and trembling slightly. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just sat together in the quiet hum of the precinct. Finally, my father let out a ragged, trembling sigh. He slowly lowered his head, staring down at our joined hands, and the dam finally broke. His voice cracked with a deep, agonizing sorrow as he began to speak. He did not express anger toward Jasmine or fury toward the federal system. Instead, he turned all the blame entirely inward. He whispered that he felt like an absolute fool. He asked me how he could have been so incredibly blind to what was happening right under his own roof. He told me that he had spent the last 2 years convincing himself that Cameron was just going through a rough patch, that Jasmine was just a bit demanding, and that things would eventually settle down. He confessed that he had noticed the missing money from his wallet, the strange credit card offers arriving in the mail, and the aggressive isolation tactics Jasmine used to keep him separated from his friends. But he had ignored all the warnings because he desperately wanted to believe that his son loved him. My father looked up at me, a single tear spilling over his eyelashes and tracking down his wrinkled cheek. He choked on his words as he asked if Cameron was right. He wondered aloud if he really was just a foolish, senile old man whose mind was failing someone so pathetic that he let his own flesh and blood manipulate him into near ruin. Hearing those words break from his lips ignited a fierce protective fire in my chest. I squeezed his hands tightly, refusing to let him carry a single ounce of guilt for the crimes committed against him. I looked him dead in the eye and kept my voice steady, projecting absolute certainty. I told my father that he was not foolish, he was not senile, and he was certainly not to blame for the vile predatory greed of the people he had tried to help. I explained that predators explicitly target good, decent people precisely because kind-hearted individuals cannot fathom that level of evil. I told him that it is never a character flaw to love your child unconditionally. The flaw belonged entirely to Cameron for weaponizing that unconditional love to fund a pathetic, shallow lifestyle. I let go of his right hand, reached into my coat pocket, and pulled out my encrypted digital tablet. I told him that I needed to show him something important, something that would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that his life was not ruined. I woke the screen, bypassed the law enforcement surveillance grid, and opened a highly secured private wealth management portal. I typed in my secondary authorization codes and navigated directly to the master ledger of the blind trust I had established 3 years ago. I turned the bright screen around and placed the tablet gently onto my father's lap. I told him to look at the numbers displayed in bold green text across the top of the dashboard. My father blinked, adjusting his eyes to the glaring screen. He read the account balances out loud, his voice dropping to a stunned, breathless whisper. He saw the exact value of his fully paid-off home equity securely locked in the trust. He saw his complete, untouched pension fund sitting safely in a shielded account. And right below that, he saw the true, unblemished balance of his actual $400,000 life savings, generating steady, healthy interest in a federally insured portfolio. I smiled warmly, letting the undeniable reality of his financial safety wash over him. I explained that the account Cameron hacked into earlier that evening was nothing but a hollow shell loaded with federal bait money. I told my father that I had spent my entire adult life studying how financial predators operate, and there was absolutely no way on earth I would ever leave the man who raised me exposed to their greed. I reassured him that every single penny he had earned during his 40 years sweating in the steel mills was perfectly safe, meticulously protected and waiting for him whenever he needed it. My father stared at the screen, tracing the digital numbers with his index finger, as if making sure they were real. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had aged him 10 years in a single night began to lift from his shoulders. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with a profound, overwhelming gratitude. He realized that he was not a victim who had lost everything. He had raised a daughter who became a shield, someone who stepped into the darkness and completely dismantled the monsters trying to tear him down. I leaned forward and told him that the house was going to be a lot quieter from now on. There would be no more screaming matches over credit card bills, no more missing money, and no more tiptoeing around his own kitchen to avoid a toxic daughter-in-law. I promised him that for the first time in years, he was completely free from the financial leeches that had drained his happiness. He was safe, his legacy was secure, and we were finally going home. 6 months later, the brutal, freezing Chicago winter that served as the backdrop for our nightmare eventually melted away, giving way to a bright, incredibly warm summer. In the half year that passed since that explosive night at the police precinct, the absolute unstoppable machinery of the federal justice system had methodically ground my brother and his wife down to fine dust. The United States government does not rush, and it certainly does not negotiate with arrogant suburban fraudsters. The federal prosecutors took their time meticulously building a concrete wall of evidence so high and so thick that no defense attorney in the country would even dare to take the case to a jury trial. Faced with the high-definition surveillance footage of the assault, the digital wire transfer logs, the forged bank documents, and the fully cooperating, terrified bank manager who eagerly turned state evidence, Cameron and Jasmine had absolutely no choice but to accept a blind plea deal. The sentencing hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in a massive wood-paneled federal courtroom downtown. I sat in the front row of the gallery with my father watching as the golden couple was led into the room, wearing matching olive green county jail jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound in heavy transport chains. The designer clothes, the expensive haircuts, and the suffocating arrogance were completely gone, replaced by the hollow, terrified posture of two people who finally realized their lives were officially over. The federal judge did not show them a single ounce of mercy. He looked down from his bench and delivered a scathing, blistering reprimand, calling their actions one of the most despicable, calculated cases of elder abuse and financial predation he had ever seen in his career. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel down and handed Jasmine a devastating sentence of 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for her role as the primary aggressor in the physical assault and her active participation in the wire fraud. Cameron, weeping openly and shaking so violently his transport chains rattled against the wooden defense table, was sentenced to 8 solid years in federal prison. The judge explicitly reminded them both that the federal prison system does not grant early parole for good behavior. They would be sitting in those concrete cells for every single day of their sentences. But the physical prison time was only half of their punishment. The financial execution I had promised them in the precinct lobby was carried out with absolute ruthless precision by the Treasury Department. The United States Marshal Service formally seized and liquidated every single luxury item they had purchased with stolen funds. The brand new top-of-the-line luxury SUV was towed away and auctioned off to the highest bidder. The massive custom diamond engagement ring, the handcrafted tennis bracelet, and Cameron's $40,000 imported luxury watch were all placed into federal evidence boxes and sold at a government auction. The proceeds from their vanity were seized to pay back the heavy court fines and the legal restitution they owed the state. Even worse than losing their current assets was the inescapable financial guillotine waiting for them upon their eventual release. The federal judge explicitly upheld the $180,000 tax penalty triggered by their theft of the honeypot retirement account. I watched my brother bury his face in his chained hands as the judge formally declared that the staggering tax debt was entirely non-dischargeable. When Cameron and Jasmine finally walk out of their federal prison cells nearly a decade from now, they will step into the world as middle-aged convicted felons with absolutely zero assets and a massive crippling debt owed directly to the Internal Revenue Service. Their wages will be permanently garnished, their bank accounts will be endlessly monitored, and they will never be able to afford so much as a luxury cup of coffee for the rest of their natural lives. The total financial ruin they tried to force upon my father had become their own permanent reality. As for the corrupt bank manager Henderson, he received a 5-year federal sentence for his role in processing the fraudulent mortgage and facilitating the syndicate money laundering. The violent underground loan sharks who had been terrorizing my brother were subsequently raided and dismantled by a joint federal task force, utilizing the exact financial mapping data Cameron had so foolishly provided through his panicked wire transfers. Every single loose end was tied up, every threat was neutralized, and the toxic infection that had plagued my family was completely excised. Now I am sitting beside my father on the wide wrap-around wooden porch of the beautiful family home. The house is completely quiet, peaceful, and entirely safe. The oppressive heavy tension that used to choke the air when Jasmine and Cameron lived down the hall has completely vanished. My father looks 10 years younger. The deep, worried lines around his eyes have smoothed out, and he smiles easily now. His arthritis is manageable, his stress is non-existent, and he spends his mornings tending to his garden and reading his books in absolute peace. He knows that his home belongs to a secure blind trust managed by a daughter who loves him, and he knows that his life savings are generating healthy protected interest in a portfolio that no predator can ever touch. I take a slow, satisfying sip of my dark roast coffee, feeling the warm summer breeze brush against my face. I look out over the manicured lawn, reflecting on the long, brutal journey that brought us to this quiet morning. I learned that you do not have to lower yourself into the dirt to fight back against toxic, greedy people. You do not have to scream, you do not have to throw punches, and you do not have to match their vicious cruelty. Sometimes the absolute best way to handle vicious family members who mistake your kindness for weakness is to simply step back and let their own boundless greed blind them. You give them exactly enough rope to hang themselves with their own arrogant mistakes, and when the knot is perfectly tight, you simply hand that rope directly to the federal government. It is the ultimate, inescapable, and perfectly lawful revenge. The profound lesson from this story is that shared blood never excuses exploitation. We are often conditioned to forgive toxic relatives, making endless excuses for their greed in the name of familial loyalty. However, true family is built on mutual respect and protection, not manipulation and deceit. Setting an immovable boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is vital self-preservation. When predators weaponize your love, the bravest thing you can do is step back and let them face their own consequences. Have you ever established a firm boundary to protect yourself from toxic relatives? And if so, please share